On May 23, 1964, the desert learned how to listen. The sun had already begun its slow retreat behind the low hills outside Barstow, leaving the highway washed in amber light and long shadows. Evening came gently that day, the kind of evening that makes time feel wider, softer. The clock on the dashboard read 7:30 p.m. when the engine coughed for the first time. Just a small hiccup, barely noticeable, the kind drivers ignore when they believe the road still belongs to them. Inside the car sat Dean Martin, relaxed as ever, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, his voice humming along to a tune drifting from the radio. Beside him was Frank Sinatra, sharp-eyed, alert, always half thinking about the next note, the next line, the next audience waiting somewhere ahead. The driver, Tony Russo, kept both hands steady on the wheel, following Interstate 15 north, the asphalt unspooling toward Las Vegas. The plan had been simple. Finish business in Los Angeles, drive through the desert, wake up in Vegas. Perform at the Sands the next night under lights bright enough to erase shadows and silence doubts. That was the rhythm of their lives in 1964, movement, momentum, applause. Both men were at the height of their powers. Dean's voice was everywhere, warm and reassuring, pouring out of jukeboxes and living room radios. Frank's presence still carried gravity, still commanded rooms without effort. They were legends in motion, escorted by schedules and expectations. And yet, even legends are passengers when the road decides otherwise. The engine sputtered again, longer this time, rougher. Tony frowned. The temperature gauge crept upward like a warning whispered too late. "What's going on?" Dean asked, not alarmed, just curious, as if the car were an old friend clearing its throat. "Don't like the sound of that," Tony said. He eased off the gas, eyes scanning the empty stretch ahead. Desert scrub, telephone poles, nothing else. Frank leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "You said this thing was solid." "It was," Tony replied. "Might still be, let me pull over." The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder, heat rising in shimmering waves from the hood. Silence rushed in, sudden and complete, broken only by the ticking of metal cooling too fast. They stepped out into the desert air. It smelled of dust and distance. Somewhere far off, a truck growled along another road unseen. Tony lifted the hood. Steam hissed up like a quiet confession. "Well," Frank said, hands on his hips, "we're not going anywhere for a bit." Tony wiped his brow. "I can try to get a tow if there's a phone nearby." He looked across the road. A flickering neon sign buzzed weakly against the dusk. "LYS Roadhouse." Dean followed Tony's gaze. He smiled, slow, amused, curious. "Looks like fate's got us stopping for a drink." Frank snorted. "In a place like that, you kidding?" "What do we have to lose?" Dean said. "Couple hours, we'll live." Frank studied the building. Low, modest, a bar that had seen more miles than dreams. Then he laughed. "All right, but if this turns into a circus, I'm blaming you." They crossed the road together, expensive shoes crunching on gravel, three silhouettes moving toward a door no one inside expected to open for them. LYS Roadhouse was warm and dim, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of conversation. About 30 people filled the room, truckers nursing beers, locals leaning into laughter, a bartender polishing glasses with practiced indifference. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, or at least their story. And then there was the piano. A young man sat there, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers careful but confident on the keys. His voice rose gently above the noise, unassuming yet sincere. "When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie." Dean froze just inside the doorway. "That's amore." For a moment the desert, the car, the schedule, all of it vanished. There was only the song, his song, sung not to impress, not to imitate, but to feel. Dean's smile faded into something quieter, something deeper. Frank noticed, "You all right?" "That kid," Dean murmured, "he's singing from somewhere real." They slipped into a corner booth, hats pulled low, sunglasses still on despite the dim light. No one recognized them. Why would they? In Barstow, legends belonged on record covers and television screens, not at sticky tables under flickering bulbs. The young man finished the song to warm applause. He nodded shyly, adjusting the microphone. "Thanks, folks," he said. "Name S. Jimmy. We're doing a little open sing tonight. Anyone wants a turn, come on up." The bartender grinned. "Don't be shy now." Dean looked at Frank. That look, the one that always meant trouble and joy in equal measure. "You're not serious," Frank whispered. Dean shrugged. Aren't you tired of people knowing who you are before you sing? Frank studied the room. Ordinary faces, honest eyes, no expectations, no pressure. He smiled. You're impossible. Dean stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he walked toward the piano, casual, unannounced, just another man with a song in mind. Mind if I try one? Dean asked. Jimmy blinked, surprised, then smiled. Sure, sir, what'll it be? Dean leaned on the piano, comfortable, relaxed. AI that a kick in the head. Jimmy laughed. All right. The first chord rang out. Dean took the microphone, not like a performer claiming a stage, but like a friend borrowing a story. His voice came out easy, playful, unpolished in the best way. Not the voice of records and rehearsals, but the voice of kitchens and back rooms and late nights when singing meant something personal. The bar went quiet. Not because people recognized him, but because something about the sound made them stop breathing. By the second line, heads had turned. By the third, someone whispered, that voice. Dean finished the song with a grin, handing the microphone back like it was nothing. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the room exploded. No way. That's him. Dean Martin. Dean tipped his hat, finally letting the truth breathe. Evening, folks. Chairs scraped, drinks sloshed, laughter and disbelief collided. Frank stood, removing his hat with mock resignation. Guess I can't hide forever. The room lost whatever composure it had left. And just like that, a broken car on a desert highway cracked open a night that would never quite end the same way again. But the real story, the one no stage could contain, was only beginning. Because before the music truly took over that small bar, before voices joined and tears fell, before anyone understood what this night would become, Dean Martin felt something he hadn't expected. Standing there under cheap lights, among strangers who didn't want anything from him except a song, he felt the weight he usually carried slip, just a little. And in that quiet space between applause and breath, memories stirred. Loss, love, the fragile truth that even the most joyful voices are shaped by grief. As Dean looked around Li's Roadhouse, he didn't see an audience. He saw people, and somewhere deep inside him, a door opened, one that hadn't been opened since the hardest night of his life. The night he learned that even laughter has an echo. The applause should have been the end of it. That was how nights like this usually worked. A surprise, a story to tell, a memory people would exaggerate over beers for years. Dean Martin could have smiled, waved, sat back down, waited for the tow truck, and left Li's Roadhouse exactly as he found it. But something in the room refused to let him go. The noise slowly settled, not into silence but into anticipation. 30 strangers stood too still, as if afraid that movement might break whatever fragile miracle had just walked into their lives. Glasses hovered midair. Cigarettes burned forgotten between fingers. Even the neon sign outside seemed to flicker more gently now, as though it too was listening. Dean looked around. Not at the faces looking back at him, but through them. Truckers with road-worn eyes. A waitress clutching her apron like armor. A bartender who had seen everything except this. And the young man at the piano, Jimmy, sitting very straight now, hands trembling slightly above the keys, trying not to stare. Dean felt the familiar itch to deflect, to joke, to turn sincerity into charm. Instead, he said quietly, "Mind if we keep going?" A beat. Then cheers erupted again, louder, rower, less polite. Frank Sinatra stepped forward, taking the microphone from Dean with mock ceremony. "All right," he said, voice smooth but warm. "But we do this our way." "What's that?" someone called out. Frank grinned. "Nobody's watching, nobody's judging. Tonight you're not an audience, you're part of it." That sentence landed heavier than applause. Frank gestured to Jimmy. "Kid, you still got some gas in those fingers." Jimmy swallowed hard. "Why, yes, sir." Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Then play like you're at home." Jimmy nodded, breath shaking, and struck the opening notes of Fly Me to the Moon. Frank didn't sing immediately. He waited. He let the piano breathe, let the room lean in, let the moment stretch just long enough to matter. When his voice finally entered, it wasn't the commanding roar of Vegas. It was softer, personal, almost conversational. "Fly Me to the Moon." People began to sing without realizing they were doing it. A low hum, a quiet chorus. Someone laughed through tears, startled by their own voice. Dean watched from the side, arms folded loosely, smiling. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't a performance. This was communion. When the song ended, Frank didn't bow. He just nodded, like a man thanking neighbors for dinner. "All right," Dean said, stepping forward again. "Let's do something dangerous." Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's usually my line." Dean turned to the room. "Who here thinks they can sing?" Hands went up, hesitant at first, then braver, then bold. Dean pointed to a woman near the bar. "You." She froze. "Me," her voice cracked. "Yeah," Dean said gently. "Come on up." She stood slowly, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. "I'm Susan," she said when she reached the piano. "I wait tables here." Frank offered his arm like a gentleman. "Susan, what do you want to sing?" She hesitated. "My Way." A murmur rippled through the room. Frank studied her face not as a critic but as someone measuring courage. "Good choice," he said. "Let's take it slow." Susan started barely above a whisper. Her voice wavered, thin with nerves and years of being unheard. Frank leaned in, not overpowering her but guiding her, breathing with her, letting her borrow his confidence until she found her own. Halfway through the song, Susan stood taller. By the final verse, she was singing. Not perfectly, not safely, but honestly. When the last note faded, the room stood as one. Susan pressed a hand to her mouth, stunned. "I didn't know I could do that," she whispered. Frank smiled softly. "Most people don't until someone lets them." Dean clapped last, not loudly but deliberately. And then he felt it. The ache. It came without warning, slipping past the laughter and warmth. A pressure behind the ribs. A memory pressing forward, unwelcome and unstoppable. Years earlier, a church too quiet, a coffin too small, his son's name echoing in his chest long after the prayers ended. Dean blinked. The piano bench creaked as someone new sat down, a massive man with calloused hands and a nervous laugh. "Name S. Joe," he said. "They call me Big Joe." Dean chuckled. "Only when you're behaving." Joe grinned. "I drive a rig, thought I'd try that's life." Dean stepped beside him, close enough to feel the heat of another human being. When Joe sang, his voice was rough, untrained, but full of grit and survival. Dean harmonized instinctively, smoothing the edges without erasing them. Two very different lives. One shared song. As they finished, Joe wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Never thought I'd sing with you," he said quietly. Dean answered just as quietly. "Never thought I'd need it as much as I did." That was when the room changed. Not louder. Deeper. People stopped asking for autographs, stopped reaching for cameras. They started telling stories instead, about lost jobs, lost spouses, missed chances, songs they used to sing when life was simpler. Dean listened. And with every story, the ache inside him grew clearer, not sharper but truer. He realized something terrifying and beautiful. For years, he had been singing to forget. Tonight, he was singing to remember. He looked at Frank, who caught his eye instantly. They didn't need words. Frank nodded once, serious now. Dean turned back to Jimmy at the piano. "Kid," he said, voice low, "you okay?" Jimmy nodded, eyes wet. "I've never been more scared in my life." Dean smiled gently. "Good, that means it matters." Jimmy's fingers found the keys again. The opening notes of That's Amore drifted through the room, slower this time. Softer, more fragile. Dean sang, but not for the room. He sang for a boy he once held. For a grief he never learned how to put down. For a truth he had hidden behind laughter for too long. When the final note faded, no one clapped. No one needed to. The room sat in stillness, 30 lives bound together by something rare and fleeting. Outside, headlights appeared. The tow truck. The world was returning. But inside Lie's roadhouse, time hesitated, knowing it would never quite belong here again. Dean took a breath, steadying himself. "One more," someone whispered. Dean looked at Frank. Frank looked at the room. And somewhere between duty and desire, between past and present, a decision formed. Because before they left, There was one thing Dean still hadn't said, and one truth this night was demanding he finally face. The tow truck's headlights washed briefly across the front windows, pale and intrusive, like reality knocking too early on a door that wasn't ready to open. A few people turned in their seats. Most didn't. Inside the bar, time had slowed into something heavier than minutes. The air felt charged, as if one wrong word might shatter what had been built, not with fame, but with honesty. Dean Martin stood near the piano, one hand resting on the worn wood, the other loosely holding the microphone. He hadn't spoken since the last note faded. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the room, beyond the bar, beyond the desert road that had brought him here. Frank watched him carefully. He knew that look. It wasn't the look Dean wore on stage, not the playful confidence, not the charming ease. This was the look Dean wore only when something inside him had cracked open and refused to close again. "Dean," Frank said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "We don't have to." Dean lifted a hand. "Give me a second," he said. His voice was steady. His chest was not. For most of his life, Dean Martin had been praised for making people forget. Forget their worries. Forget their loneliness. Forget the weight they carried home at night. He did it with laughter, with warmth, with a voice that felt like a drink at the end of a long day. But there was one thing Dean himself had never forgotten. And he had never sung about it. He looked around the room again, really looked this time. Susan sat back at her table, hands clasped tight, eyes red but shining. Big Joe leaned against the bar, suddenly smaller than his size suggested. Jimmy sat at the piano, barely breathing, sensing that something fragile was unfolding in front of him. Dean swallowed. "You know," he began, forcing a smile that didn't quite hold, "people think singing is about hitting notes, or entertaining, or selling records." A few heads nodded. Dean shook his head slowly. "It's not. It's about telling the truth when you finally stop being afraid of it." The room leaned in. "I've sung a lot of songs in my life," he continued. "Happy ones, funny ones, songs about love and wine and good times." A pause. "There's one I never sang." Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dean looked down at the floor, "Because I didn't know how." No one spoke. Even the tow truck engine outside idled more softly now, as if the night itself was listening. Dean turned to Jimmy. "Do you know you'll never walk alone?" Jimmy's eyes widened. "Yes," he whispered, "but—" "That's all right," Dean said gently. "Just follow me." Jimmy hesitated, then nodded. His fingers found the keys, pressing lightly, cautiously, as though the piano might break under the weight of what was coming. The opening notes filled the bar. Dean closed his eyes. And for the first time that night, he wasn't performing at all. His voice came out lower than usual, rougher, stripped of polish. Each word carried something unfinished, something long held back. "When you walk through a storm." His voice faltered. Dean stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. He turned away from the microphone, pressing his fingers briefly against his eyes. For a moment, it seemed as if he might step back, make a joke, retreat into the safety he'd worn for decades. Instead, he inhaled, deep, deliberate, and faced the room again. "I lost my son," he said. No build-up, no explanation. Just the truth, finally spoken aloud in a room full of strangers. "He was young, too young, and when it happened, I didn't know what to do with the pain." Dean's voice shook now, but he didn't stop. "So I laughed, I worked, I sang. I made everyone else feel better because I couldn't let myself feel anything at all." Susan covered her mouth. Big Joe lowered his head. Jimmy's hands trembled over the keys, but he kept playing, soft and steady. Dean returned to the microphone. "Hold your head up high." His voice broke again, openly this time. Tears ran down his face, unhidden, unashamed. No one looked away. No one shifted. 30 people held their breath as one man finally allowed himself to grieve. Frank stepped closer, not singing, just standing there, present, solid, unmovable. A hand rested briefly on Dean's back, grounding him. Dean finished the song barely above a whisper. "You'll never walk alone." When the last note faded, no one applauded. They couldn't. The room sat suspended in something sacred and unbearable and beautiful all at once. Dean lowered the microphone slowly. I didn't plan to say that, he admitted quietly, but you all gave me a place where I could. Susan stood first. She didn't clap, she walked over and hugged him. Then Big Joe followed. Then the bartender. One by one, people stood, not to touch a legend, not to claim a story, but to stand with a man who had trusted them with his pain. Frank wiped his eyes and laughed softly. You know, pal, he said, voice thick, Vegas never gives you that. Dean managed a small smile. No, he said, it doesn't. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice shaking. Mr. Martin, Dean, I don't know what to say. Dean turned to him. You don't have to say anything, kid, you listened. That's more than enough. Outside, Tony cleared his throat near the door. The car's ready. A collective sigh rippled through the room. No one wanted the night to end. Dean looked around once more, memorizing faces, voices, the feeling in his chest that no applause had ever given him. This, he said softly, is what music is for. Frank raised the microphone one last time. All right, folks, one final song together. Jimmy struck the opening chords of New York, New York. This time everyone sang. Off-key, loud, honest. The walls shook. The small bar became something far bigger than itself, a place where pain had been shared and light had followed. As the song ended, Dean stood still, overwhelmed. He knew something now. This night wasn't just about chance or kindness or even music. It was about release. And before he walked out that door, there was one promise he still had to make. One that would change a young pianist's life forever. The final note faded into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, like the room itself was holding its breath. No applause came. Not because the moment didn't deserve it, but because clapping felt wrong. Too loud, too small. What had happened inside Li's roadhouse could not be measured by sound or hands striking together. It lived somewhere deeper, where memories settle and never quite leave. Dean Martin stood still, microphone resting at his side, eyes glistening but calm now. The tears had passed. What remained was lighter, like something heavy had finally been set down after years of carrying it alone. Frank Sinatra broke the stillness first. Well, he said quietly, clearing his throat, if we don't leave now, we're never getting to Vegas. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the room, easing the tension without breaking it. Dean nodded slowly. He's right. The words landed harder than anyone expected. People shifted in their seats. Some stood. Some didn't want to move at all, afraid that standing up might signal the end. Dean looked around one last time, committing the room to memory. The scratched tables, the low ceiling, the faces that had become witnesses to something he never meant to share but desperately needed to. This wasn't planned, Dean said. None of it, but some of the best things in life aren't. He turned toward Jimmy at the piano. Kid, Dean said gently, come here. Jimmy stood on unsteady legs and approached, eyes wide, heart pounding. He looked like someone who had just woken up inside a dream and wasn't sure which part would disappear first. Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple card. No drama, no flourish, just paper and ink. Call me next week, Dean said, pressing it into Jimmy's hand. Not to say thank you, not to talk about tonight, to talk about your future. Jimmy stared at the card, hands shaking. You really mean that? Dean met his eyes. I don't say things I do mean. Frank stepped closer. And when you call, he added, make sure you're ready to work. Talent gets you noticed. Discipline keeps you there. Jimmy nodded, tears slipping free now. I won't waste it. I know, Dean said softly. That's why I'm giving it to you. Tony appeared at the door again, respectful, almost reluctant. They're ready when you are. Dean sighed, not in frustration, but in acceptance. All right, he said, time to go. A murmur of protest filled the room. One more minute. One more song. Please. Dean raised a hand. No more songs, he said kindly. If we sing again, this night will start feeling like something we planned. Frank laughed, and that would ruin it. Dean walked toward the bar. Bartender Mike stood frozen, unsure what to do with his hands, his face flushed with emotion. Drinks are on the house, Mike said quickly. All night, this one's special. Dean slid a folded bill across the bar. Mike opened it and froze. Dean, this is. Split it, Dean said. Between everyone who showed up tonight, no exceptions. Mike swallowed hard. Thank you. Dean shook his head. No, thank you. People lined up not for autographs, not for photos, but for something simpler. A handshake, a quiet word, a shared look that said, I'll remember this. Susan hugged Dean tightly. You made me brave tonight, she whispered. Dean hugged her back. You already were. Big Joe shook Dean's hand with both of his. You didn't sing at us, he said. You sang with us. Dean smiled. That's the only way worth singing. Frank lingered at the door, scanning the room one last time. You folks take care of each other, he said. Places like this matter more than you know. Then they were gone. The door closed behind them. The neon sign outside buzzed again, louder now, as if trying to make sense of what had just passed through. No one spoke for a long time. Eventually, Jimmy returned to the piano, not to perform, but to sit. His fingers rested on the keys without pressing them. Susan finally said it out loud. Did that really just happen? Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, it did. And somehow, life continued. But it didn't continue the same way. Years passed. Jimmy Patterson made the call. Dean kept his word. Lowe's Angels followed. Studio sessions, small tour, hard lessons. Jimmy never became a superstar, but he became something better. He became someone who belonged. He would later say, Dean Martin didn't give me fame. He gave me permission to believe I was enough. Li's Roadhouse changed too. Not on the outside. The walls stayed worn, the floor still creaked. But every May 23rd, the place filled early. People came not for celebrities, but for the story. They sang. They remembered. They passed the microphone to strangers. And every year, someone told the same truth in a slightly different way. That was the night two legends broke down on the side of the road and found themselves again. Decades later, when interviews asked Dean Martin about his favorite performance, he never mentioned the Sands or Vegas or television specials. He said, there were 30 people in a bar who reminded me why I sang in the first place. Frank Sinatra once put it more simply, fame isolates you. That night connected us back to being human. The car broke down. The road stopped. And for a few hours in a small town, music did what it was always meant to do. It didn't make people famous. It made them feel less alone. And that is why, long after the last note faded, that night never really ended.